The cap was the hardest part. Not the rough linen dress, not the chapped redness the cold water had brought to her hands by the second day, not even the way the housekeeper looked through her, as though she were a piece of furniture that had learned to carry trays. It was the cap, white, stiff at the edges, pulled low enough to reshape the top of her face into something unremarkable. Annora Kestwick had worn a lot of things she hadn't chosen in the last 3 years. She had grown tolerably expert at it. The great hall of Kestwick Park blazed that evening, the way it had always blazed on the nights her father entertained. Every chandelier lit, every mirror throwing light back across the polished floor. She had stood in this doorway as a child and thought the room looked like the inside of something living. She thought the same thing now, holding a tray of champagne coupes, and the thought brought something sharp to the back of her throat that she had no time for, so she swallowed it and moved forward into the crowd. The guests parted around her without looking. She had learned that quickly. Move with purpose, look at no one above the level of their cravat, and the quality will fold around you like water around a stone. Nobody sees a housemaid at a party. Nobody is meant to. That was, at this moment, the only advantage she had. Malcolm Vexley was across the room near the tall windows, and he was in excellent form. He always was in a crowd. He had a particular trick of holding his chin when he listened, a posture that made whoever he was speaking with feel that their words were the most important words said in any room that evening. Annora had watched him practice it once, in front of the looking-glass in what had been her father's study. She had thought at the time that she was imagining things. That was before she understood the full measure of what Malcolm Vexley was. He was 42 years old, her late father's cousin, and he had been managing the Kestwick estate since the autumn 3 years ago, when her father died without warning, and she had learned, in the same week, she buried him, that Malcolm held what he claimed was her father's final testament, a document that left the entirety of Kestwick Park and its income to him, to be held in trust for the male line, with a single clause providing a modest annual sum for Annora until such time as she married suitably. Suitable being, the solicitor had explained with evident discomfort, defined at Malcolm's discretion. She had been 21. She had gone to stay with a maternal aunt in Edinburgh. She had written 6 letters to the family solicitor, and received one in return, a brief and careful note advising her not to pursue the matter further at this time. She had not followed that advice, but it had taken her 3 years to find what she'd come back for. The document she needed was somewhere in this house. She was almost certain of it. Her mother had been methodical in a way her father never was, and there had been a habit. Annora had seen it done, as a girl, of keeping certain papers inside the back panel of the old writing cabinet in the upper library, the cabinet that had been her grandmother's, that Malcolm would not have known to look inside, because he had never been invited to the upper rooms often enough to notice it. She had been here 8 days. She had not yet managed to reach the upper library alone. She shifted the tray and moved along the edge of the room. The crowd was thick tonight, all bare shoulders and dark coats, and the smell of too much perfume fawn above too many candles, and Annora navigated it by instinct, by the particular memory of feet that had crossed this floor 1,000 times before. She was almost at the far door when Malcolm's voice rose above the room. "I should like you to meet someone," he said, and there was warmth in it, the proud warmth of a man displaying something he has worked hard to acquire. "My wife, Lady Kestwick." Annora stopped walking. She stopped because every nerve in her body stopped with her. The tray went still in her hands. The crowd nearby opened slightly, drawn by Malcolm's voice, the way crowds always turn to warmth and loudness, and through the gap she saw them. Malcolm, with his hand on the arm of a woman in deep amber silk. The woman was beautiful. She had a way of standing that said she had never once been uncertain of her welcome. She inclined her head to the group of guests and said something low and pleased, and they all leaned toward her, because people always lean toward certainty. Lady Kestwick, Malcolm had said. That was Annora's mother's title, her title by rights that went back 200 years. This woman in amber silk was wearing it the way she was wearing the necklace at her throat, as a decoration, as an accessory, as something that belonged to her because it had been placed there by someone who chose it for her. Annora stood 9 feet away, holding a tray of champagne she had not been offered, and she did not move. There was a ringing in her ears that had nothing to do with the music. She had known this was coming. She had suspected, from certain remarks the housekeeper had made, from the way the master bedroom had been freshly papered, from the monogrammed linens that Malcolm had found himself a wife to complete the picture he was painting. Knowing had not prepared her for the actual sight of it. Nothing could have. She told herself, do not look at her. Do not look at him. Fix your face, set it to blank and pleasant. Look at the middle distance until the moment passes. She had learned this skill at her aunt's dinner table, where she sat below 3 female cousins who never missed an occasion to remind her of the exact nature of her dependence. She knew how to look at nothing. She was doing it now, and she thought no one saw. She was wrong. At the far side of the room, a little apart from the rest, in the way of a man who holds himself apart, not out of rudeness but out of a lifelong habit of observation. A tall man in a dark coat had not been looking at Malcolm, and had not been looking at the woman in amber, and had not been looking at the new guests who were admiring the introduction. He had been looking at the housemaid near the door, the one holding the tray. He had noticed her an hour earlier, for reasons he could not entirely have named. Something in the way she moved through the room, too quiet, too precise, too careful about where she placed her eyes. Servants at a party like this were invisible by practice. This woman was invisible by intention. And there was a difference. And it was the kind of difference that a man who had spent 20 years in legal affairs had learned to notice. He had watched her face when Malcolm made his introduction. He had seen the precise moment the words reached her. The small, controlled flinch, the steadying of the tray in her hands, the deliberate smooth-over that followed. And he had seen, because he was close enough, and because the chandelier was generous, that her jaw was set in the particular way of a person who is using every muscle in their face to prevent it from doing something else entirely. He watched her choose, in the space of a single breath, to remain still and remain silent. And then he watched her turn away toward the servant's door, as if she had never stopped walking, as if nothing at all had happened. His name was Merrick, the Duke of Ravenport, and he was at Kestwick Park that evening, because he sat on the board of trustees for the old Kestwick estate settlement, had done so for years, and because Malcolm Vexley had sent him an invitation, and because there were 1 or 2 things about the Kestwick settlement that had been troubling him of late. A man with questions sometimes found answers more easily at a dinner table than at a solicitor's desk. He had not expected to find a housemaid with a face like that. He told himself it was nothing, a servant who had taken a dislike to the new mistress. It was not unheard of in old household establishments with long loyalties. He dismissed it and went back to watching Malcolm Vexley work his crowd. But the face stayed with him, through dinner, through the gentleman's hour afterward, and it was still with him the following afternoon when he came in from the grounds to find the upper corridor of the east wing empty, and a door that should have been locked. The door to what he knew from the estate plans was called the upper library, standing 3 inches ajar. He paused. He ought to continue to his own rooms. He told himself this clearly. He continued to the door anyway and pushed it open. She was at the writing cabinet in the corner. The back panel was open. She had both hands inside it, and she was so focused on what her fingers were finding that she did not hear him until he was 3 steps into the room. Then she spun around, and Merrick had 1 second of seeing her face without her defenses up, wide-eyed, pale, and absolutely not the face of a woman who did not know what she was looking for. She recovered in an instant, pulled her hands back, straightened, put the smooth and useful blankness on. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low and quite steady. "I was told to dust in here this afternoon." He looked at her, then at the writing cabinet, whose back panel was very clearly not dusty, but had been opened by someone who knew exactly where to press. Then at her again. "The housekeeper," he said carefully, "is a woman named Mrs. Rouse." "Yes, Your Grace. She told me at breakfast this morning that this room is kept locked because Mr. Vexley is having the shelves recatalogued, and no one is to enter without his permission." The silence was very brief, very controlled. "I must have misunderstood my instructions," the woman said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, rain had begun against the windows, gray and insistent. The woman in the servant's dress and white cap stood in front of the open writing cabinet with her hands folded and her face arranged into perfect, practiced neutrality, and she waited for whatever he would do. "Who are you?" he said, not as a demand, as a genuine question. "My name is—" She stopped, started again. "My name is Anne. I've been with the household 3 weeks." "No," he said in the same tone a person uses when they are declining to pretend. "I don't think that's quite right." Something in her face shifted. Not broke, she was too practiced for that, but shifted, as though something underneath had moved of its own accord. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was no longer a housemaid's voice. It was low, still, and exact. "Whatever you believe you've seen, I would ask you to forget it. I am here for one thing only, and it will harm no one who does not deserve to be harmed, and if you leave this room now and tell no one you found it open, I will be gone from this house in 2 days, and you will never have to consider me again." He did not leave. "The writing cabinet," he said. "It belonged to the late Lady Kestwick, did it not? I saw it noted in the estate inventory." A pause. "Yes." "And you knew to look inside the back panel." No answer, but she didn't deny it. "I have been a trustee of the Kestwick estate settlement for 11 years, Merrick said. "I tell you this not to threaten you with it, but because certain things about this estate have been troubling me for several months, and I came to this party for reasons that have nothing to do with Malcolm Vexley's hospitality, and what I have found is not what I expected to find." Her eyes, gray, an unusual light gray, were fixed on him. "What have you found?" she said, very quietly. "A settlement that does not align in several particulars with what I know of the old Earl's intentions. A will witnessed by 2 men who both died within the following year, and a daughter who appears in the estate correspondence up until 3 years ago, and then, very suddenly, does not appear at all." He paused. "Would you know anything about that?" She looked at him for a long time. The rain went on against the window. Somewhere below, someone laughed loudly, and the sound came up through the floor like something from another world. "My name," she said at last, "is Annora Kestwick. This is my father's house. That cabinet was my mother's. And the document I believe is inside it is a codicil to my father's will that my mother lodged privately with the family's records, which would, if I am correct, make the will Malcolm Vexley produced 3 years ago exactly what I believe it to be, which is a forgery." The words sat between them in the gray afternoon light. Merrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you find it?" Annora reached into her apron pocket. Her fingers were shaking slightly, the first uncontrolled thing she had done in 8 days, and she drew out a folded paper, old paper, browned at the creases, sealed in an older fashion, unopened. "I haven't looked yet," she said. "I didn't. I needed a moment." She swallowed. "I've been looking for 3 years. I wasn't ready for it to simply be there." Merrick took one step forward and then stopped because he was not a man who moved into other people's moments without invitation. He waited. Annora looked at the document in her hands. Then, with the deliberateness of someone who has decided a thing and will not reconsider, she broke the seal and opened it. She read. Her face gave nothing away during the first lines, and then something happened to it. Something small and devastating around the eyes. And she folded the paper closed again with great care, as though it might shatter. "It's here," she said. "All of it." Her voice was quite controlled. "My mother left instruction that if my father died without revising his will, the whole of the Kestwick estate and its associated trusts were to pass to me directly, with no provision for the Vexley line. She feared this. She wrote it in 1897, when I was 14. She paused. She knew. Then we need," Merrick began. The door opened. Malcolm Vexley stood in the doorway. He was not alone. The butler was behind him, and behind the butler, a footman who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. Malcolm's eyes went from Merrick to Annora, to the writing cabinet, to the document in her hand, and Merrick watched the calculation happen in real time, fast and cold behind the eyes. "Annora," Malcolm said, measured, the voice of a man deciding which angle to approach from. "I see you've found your way back." "Malcolm," she said. "I don't know what she's told you, Your Grace," he said, turning to Merrick with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But I should tell you that my cousin has been in an unfortunate way since my uncle's death. She has convinced herself of certain things that are, well," he spread his hands. "She's not well. She has made accusations before, to solicitors, to the bank, to myself. We've tried to get her the help she needs, but she is very stubborn, as you can see." He glanced at the writing cabinet. "She has a history of taking things that don't belong to her." "I have taken nothing," Annora said. "I found a document hidden inside a piece of furniture that belonged to my mother." "A document she fabricated," Malcolm said smoothly. "As she fabricated the letters she sent 3 years ago. Ask anyone who dealt with her then." He looked at Merrick with something very like pity. "I'm sorry you've been drawn into this, Your Grace. She is a very convincing young woman when she chooses to be." Merrick said nothing. He was watching Annora's face. What he saw there was not madness. It was not fabrication. It was the precise, clamped-down fury of a person who has heard their own clear truth called a symptom so many times that they have stopped being surprised by it, and have decided simply to endure it one more time, because they are holding a piece of paper, and the paper does not lie, and the paper is going nowhere. A codicil, if genuine, will have been drafted by a solicitor of record and will carry a registration date, Merrick said. It is not possible to fabricate those things convincingly. He looked at Malcolm. "I should like to take it to the estate solicitors for verification, this afternoon, if that can be arranged." "Your Grace." "This is an estate matter," Merrick said, in a voice that did not admit discussion. "I am a trustee of this estate. The verification of testamentary documents is precisely within my remit. You will oblige me by not obstructing it." Malcolm's face did a complicated thing. "Of course," he said, after a pause that was half a breath too long. But that evening, while Merrick had gone ahead to arrange matters with the solicitors in the village, things moved quickly in the house. They always moved quickly when Malcolm Vexley saw the floor begin to shift under him, and Annora had not anticipated how fast. By 10 o'clock she had been informed by Mrs. Rouse that her services were no longer required, that her things were being packed, and that a carriage would take her to the coaching inn. "Tonight?" Annora said. Mr. Vexley thought it best, Mrs. Rouse said, and had the grace to look at the floor when she said it. The document. Mr. Vexley has asked that all estate-related papers be held by his own solicitor pending review. They had taken it. While she was speaking with Mrs. Rouse, someone had gone into the library and taken it. Annora sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the servants' room and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been here before, not in this room, in this situation. The moment when the one thing she had managed to secure was taken back, and she was left with nothing, and someone in a better coat had decided that her version of events was the version that didn't count. She had been here for 3 years. She was very tired of it. She thought about what was left to her. She thought systematically, the way she'd learned to think in Edinburgh when sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had no document now. She had the name she'd given Merrick. She had the memory of what she'd read in those few brief moments, including the name of the solicitor her mother had consulted, a name she recognized, because the man had come to the house twice in her childhood. He might still be alive. He would certainly have copies. She went to find paper and a pen. She was writing the letter when Christabel Muir came in. Annora had seen her at breakfast twice, but never this close. She was striking without her public armor on, plainer and sharper, and she looked at Annora the way someone looks at a problem they have been putting off addressing. "He told me who you are," Christabel said, no preamble. "2 days ago, when he first realized you were here." She came into the room and closed the door. "I want you to know I didn't know before, about you, about the will." Annora set down the pen. "What did you know?" "That he had a cousin who was inconvenient, that the estate had come to him cleanly." A pause. "I believed him." "Most people did," Annora said. "He is very easy to believe." Christabel looked at her for a moment. Then, "He told me tonight that he was going to have you removed, and then file a complaint with the county magistrate claiming you'd broken in and stolen something. He knows one of the magistrates." Her mouth was flat and unhappy. "He was going to let them take you in." Annora was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because," Christabel said carefully, "I am telling the Duke." She had the look of a woman who has just made a decision she knows she will not walk back from. "I have the original certificate of the will's registration. Malcolm gave it to me for safekeeping 2 years ago," he thought. She stopped. "He thought I would always choose him. He was wrong." She left without saying anything else. Annora sat in the quiet of the servants' room with the unfinished letter on the table in front of her, and understood that the thing she had spent 3 years trying to do alone had just been handed to her by the last person she would have chosen to help her. She was not sure what to do with that feeling, so she finished the letter, addressed it to the solicitor whose name she carried only in memory, and went to find the kitchen boy who made the early post. The morning brought the Duke. He came before breakfast, with a solicitor from the village and 2 men from the county registry office, and what Christabel had given him the night before. The original registration certificate, irrefutably dated, irrefutably genuine, was enough to have Malcolm Vexley's claim to Kestwick Park suspended pending formal inquiry before lunch. Malcolm did not come down for breakfast. Annora stood in the entrance hall, not in the apron, not in the cap, in her own traveling dress, which was 3 years old and somewhat too large because she had been smaller when it was made. And she watched the solicitor speak to the county men, and she felt for the first time in a very long time that the floor beneath her was solid. The Duke found her there. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, in the way he'd had since the beginning of knowing her, the way that asked before it assumed. "It will take several months," he said. "There will be a formal inquiry. You will be asked to give evidence, and it will not be comfortable, and there will be people who require convincing." "I know," she said. "The solicitor, whose name you gave me. I sent a telegraph this morning. His offices confirmed they hold a copy of the codicil and have been waiting 3 years for someone to inquire after it." She breathed in slowly. "Your mother," he said, "appears to have been a thorough woman." She was. Annora was quiet for a moment. She was also afraid. "I think she knew what Malcolm was capable of, and she tried to protect me the only way she could, by hiding things where she thought I would eventually look for them." She touched the doorframe beside her, the old wood, the paint her father had put on when she was 12, which was chipping now at the corner and hadn't been attended to. She'd noticed it the first day, coming in with the servants. She was right. I just took longer than she'd planned. 3 years is not very long, Merrick said, to accomplish what you've accomplished. She looked at him. He was not the kind of man who said reassuring things he didn't mean. She had noticed this early. "You came back last night," she said, "when you could have waited until morning." "I had reason to believe the morning would be too late." He paused. "Also, I didn't want to wait." The hall was quiet around them. Outside, a carriage was being called. The ordinary machinery of a large house in crisis, going on around 2 people standing still in the middle of it. "I should like to call properly," Merrick said, "when this is settled, if you would receive me." "You may call," Annora said. "I can't promise to receive you in anything better than this coat for several months, since there are legal matters to attend to before I can afford a new one." He looked at the coat. "I've seen you in a housemaid's apron," he said. "I suspect you'll manage." She nearly smiled. It surprised her, the nearness of it. She wasn't sure she'd had occasion for nearly smiling in a considerable time. The inquiry ran from October into March. There were 3 weeks in January, when it seemed as though Malcolm's solicitors might succeed in having the registration certificate declared inadmissible on a technicality that made Annora wake at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark of her aunt's Edinburgh house, remembering the smell of her father's study. But the old solicitor's copy held, the registry office's independent record held, and Christabel Muir, who had no particular reason left to protect Malcolm Vexley, and every reason to protect herself, gave evidence that was so precise and so completely unrattled by cross-examination that the inquiry panel sat very quietly for a full minute after she finished speaking. Malcolm was found to have procured a fraudulent will, administered the estate under false representation, and suppressed a valid testamentary document for a period of 3 years. He was given the choice men in his position were given in such cases. He chose the one that did not involve a public criminal proceeding, which meant a quiet return of the estate and a complete withdrawal, and the social consequences of that withdrawal, which in a world their size were very nearly as severe as the legal ones. In April, Annora came home. Not with ceremony. She hadn't wanted ceremony. She came on a Tuesday morning with 2 cases and the family solicitor and a letter from the county registry, and she walked through the door of Kestwick Park and stood in the entrance hall, while the housekeeper waited and the footman waited, and the cook came to the kitchen door and then retreated again when she saw this was a private moment. Annora stood in the hall and looked up at the chandelier, which needed new candles, and at the peeling paint at the corner of the doorframe, and at the portrait of her grandmother on the landing, which had been turned slightly on its hook and needed straightening. 3 years, she thought, and then I'm here. And then she stopped thinking and just stood in her own house in the April morning and let that be enough for a while. Merrick called on the Thursday. He came correctly, in the afternoon, with his card sent ahead, and Annora received him in what had been her mother's sitting room, which she had opened up the day before and had someone air out, because it still smelled faintly of her mother's perfume, and she had decided she liked that and wanted to keep it. They had tea. They talked about the inquiry, and the settlement, and the letter she'd had from Christabel, which was short and contained no apology, and ended with a line that had stayed with her. "I have always been better at surviving than at being good. I hope the two of you manage to be both." "She was not wrong to help you," Merrick said, "whatever her reasons." "No," Annora said. "She wasn't." She looked at her teacup. "I've been trying to decide what I think about her. I keep arriving at something like a kind of recognition. We both spent a long time surviving inside a situation someone else built around us. Her choices were worse than mine, but I'm not sure they were made from a worse place." He looked at her in the way he'd had from the beginning. "You are very fair," he said, "for someone who was dealt a considerable wrong." "Fairness costs less than I used to think it did," she said, "when you're not spending all of your energy on simply staying upright." They were quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way that people who have been through something difficult together sometimes settle into silence without discomfort. "I should like to say something," Merrick said then, "and I should like to say it once, clearly, so that you know where I stand and can consider it at whatever pace suits you." Annora set down her cup. "I waited to say anything that wasn't strictly necessary until the inquiry was finished," he said. "Because a woman in the middle of a legal fight to recover her own inheritance has more than enough to consider without someone introducing a further complication. I wanted you to have this settled first, this house, this name, this life, so that it was entirely yours before I asked if there was any part of it you might want to share." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking now, not because you need me. You've made it exceptionally clear you don't, which I find, if anything, more compelling than the alternative. But because I have thought about you a great deal since a wet afternoon in an upstairs library, and I would rather tell you that plainly than arrange it into something more decorative." Annora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the white cap and the champagne tray, and the way she'd had to arrange her face when she heard her own title spoken from another woman's mouth. She thought about 3 years of letters and rooms that weren't hers, and the particular exhaustion of being a person whose word no one weighted fairly. She thought about a man who had not left when she told him to leave. "I'll want a long engagement," she said. "I've just got my house back, and I intend to spend some months being in it." "That is entirely reasonable," he said. "And I'll want to walk myself up the aisle when the time comes." "That also seems reasonable. And I would like it understood from the beginning that Kestwick Park is mine, not ours in the managing sense. Mine." "It was always yours," he said. "I have 11 years of trust records that will confirm it." She nearly smiled again. It came easier now. She was out of practice, but it was coming back, like most things. "Then yes," she said, "I'll consider it." "That is a great deal more than I hoped for," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a duke's voice, not quite a trustee's voice, something lower and quieter and considerably less controlled, and Annora found that she didn't mind it at all. The following October, on a morning when the grounds had gone gold, and the chandelier had been relit with new candles, Annora Kestwick stood in the doorway of the great hall and watched the guests arrive. There were a good number of them, neighbors, county officials, the family, solicitor, and his wife, several people who had been present at the party the October before, when a housemaid with a champagne tray had stood near the wall and had not been seen. They saw her now. She saw the moment each face placed her. The daughter returned, the estate restored, the title sitting on her exactly as it was meant to sit. She saw some of them remember. She did not look away while they did. She did not move to the wall. She stood in the doorway of her own house, in a gown she had chosen herself, with her mother's small cameo at her throat, and her own name announced at the door by a footman who had served this household since her childhood. And she let the room come to her. Merrick found her there after the first hour, in the manner of a man who had been looking for her from across it. "You are standing in the doorway," he observed. "I used to stand near the wall," she said. "I'm trying something new." He offered her his arm. Annora Kestwick, who had navigated 3 years of cold rooms and closed doors, and the particular cruelty of being unmade so slowly that she had almost not noticed it happening, looked at the arm the Duke of Ravenport offered her and felt, without any performance at all, that the floor beneath her was solid. She took it.